So as Tom introduced, I'm Fergus. I am a trustee of the Happold Foundation, but I'm also an associate in Bureau Happold's sustainability team and a member of the Practices Urban Research Programme CLAB. So thank you to all of you for joining us this evening, and especially to the panel of speakers that we'll hear from shortly. So tonight we're here to discuss the topic of adapt or move, and just to get us going, I thought I'd provide some context as to why this is an important discussion to be having now before we hear the viewpoint of each of our speakers. So as many of those of you on the call will know, even with the most ambitious efforts to reduce carbon emissions, our climate will continue to change, and if you like, a certain amount of change is locked in, and we will have to become resilient to this and able to adapt and able to cope with this. And sea level rise is just one of those changes. And as you may have read in the event synopsis, it's estimated that around 275 million people worldwide live in areas that may eventually be flooded with 3 degrees of warming. I think it's important to acknowledge that sea level rise is just one of the changes that we're likely to see, and alarmingly, the annual ecological threats register forecasts that by 2050, 1.2 billion people will be displaced as a result of issues such as water stress, food insecurity, droughts, floods, cyclones, rising temperatures and sea levels, either as a direct consequence of those or as an event which may be triggered by them. So in the context of the built environment and a changing climate, these terms, mitigation, resilience, adaptation, they're all terms which we are generally comfortable with. Society at large is generally comfortable with these terms or getting more comfortable with them. But we are seeing evidence that for many communities globally, we're having to turn to a strategy that society is less comfortable with and less versed in, and this is retreat. And this challenge is a present day issue for coastal and inland communities across the globe, and it's likely to become more so with time. So tonight is not a conversation about giving up on efforts to mitigate CO2 emissions at all, but it is a conversation about how we build adaptive capacity to the impacts of climate change, and especially when we may need to turn to this alternative strategy of retreat, and what this entails for communities, for us as built environment practitioners, and for those cities within which we work and live. So without further ado, I'll now introduce you to each of our speakers and ask them to provide us with a short 5 to 10 minute insight to their reflections on the topic, and then we'll open the floor to conversation. In the past, we have introduced these conversations in a manner that we ask you to imagine that our speakers are sat in a living room together having a conversation, and that you're able to peer into this living room and chip into the conversation, to ask questions, to share reflections. And I think with the current situation, this metaphor is probably more accurate than ever. So please do share your questions, share your experiences, type them into the chat box. We'll keep an eye on them. We'll forward them on to the panelists, and we might even ask you to unmute yourselves and share your questions and reflections with the panel. So with that, Richard, I believe you are going to kick us off just as an introduction. You'll have seen, hopefully you've seen Richard's biography in the event synopsis, but Professor Richard Dawson has spent the last 2 decades researching and analysing climatic impacts on the UK's catchment cities and infrastructure. He's a member of the Adaptation Subcommittee to the UK Climate Change Committee, a member of the National Infrastructure Commission's Technical Expert Panel, a member of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research and UK Collaboratorium for Research on Infrastructure in Cities, and he was the lead author of the chapter on infrastructure in the UK CCC 2017 UK Climate Risk Assessment. Over to you, Richard.
Okay, thanks. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So I'm going to try and give a little bit of a context of some of the challenges and some of the, I suppose, issues that have plagued me and make this, I think, both an interesting but difficult issue to address. So here a picture of Haysborough taken about 10 years ago. I don't think the cafe is there anymore. This is on the North Norfolk coast of England. And kind of one of the first examples of this problem of sea levels rising, soft cliffs eroding, and villages effectively being abandoned by choices about where to defend, where to protect, and where not to. But I think first off, it's important to just recognise this is a global issue, as we saw in one of the slides just presented, that around the world, along most shorelines, sea levels are rising, and they are increasing the risk of flooding or coastal erosion to hundreds of millions of people globally. And so this is just one sort of those maps. It's very difficult to show these things in great resolution at a global scale, but looking at the axis or the legend of this map, you should get a sense that there's an awful lot of people in some of these countries in low-lying land at risk. And this is just a relatively modest sea level rise scenario, one of the middle range ones that the IPCC look at in terms of assessing risks from climate change. Closer to home in the UK, the Committee on Climate Change released a report a couple of years ago looking at flood and erosion risks. And here I quote a few figures from just England. And these are all just properties. So alongside that, you know, hundreds of kilometres of infrastructure and some key critical infrastructure substations and other water treatment plants and so on, sited in coastal floodplain areas. But what I thought was interesting about this was that for the most part, the kind of proposed shoreline management plans actually, you know, provide pretty good value for money in terms of risk reduction. However, there are a few hundred kilometres where, you know, the current policy is not beneficial, i.e. it's going to cost more than the sort of return in benefits, at least in pure economic benefit terms. And where actually rather a lot more, about 1,500 kilometres of coastline in England, where the current policy is beneficial in terms of the benefit to costs ratio, but it's the ratio, that ratio is far lower than those typically able to receive funding from the Environment Agency's limited pot. But one of the big challenges here is that actually our shoreline management plans are not statutory and they're not guaranteed to receive funding, which is where some of the controversy, certainly in England, often arises. People expecting one thing, having fed into and agreed a plan in often increasingly kind of collaborative approach, only to discover it doesn't get the money to realise it. Typically, you know, the responses or the options on the coast fall into about 6 categories. And the first one is no response. That is actually an option to do nothing. A fairly typical response to increase the level of flood defence protection or to accommodate. So in some cases, this might involve raising properties or adapting building codes in some other way to cope with increased risk of flooding. We're increasingly seeing more of a move towards sort of ecosystem-based adaptation. So this is still a sort of built around the concept of protection, but trying to restore natural processes to provide a degree of that protection. Retreats, an option that is, I suppose, kind of one of the key things of the discussion and provocation here, that limited examples of planned retreats, I think, exist, and where they are, maybe they're often built around 1 or 2 iconic structures, such as this lighthouse in actually, I think, in Denmark, being moved back just as one individual structure. And then another one though is this idea of advance, not something we see too often as a kind of a strategy. But this is a concept design for Jakarta, building something called the Great Wall of Jakarta, or proposed Great Wall of Jakarta, both coastal protection to protect the sort of sinking city, whilst also providing residential, commercial, and other opportunities on a kind of a new offshore island and breakwater. So all of these, though, are sort of premised around what's really going on the coastline, that sort of thin blue line or maybe it's yellow in many cases, of where the water and land meet, and moving it forwards, backwards, or holding it roughly where it is. One of the things that we've heard a lot about recently in coastal management is this principle of adaptive management, trying to respond to change. So as the sea level rises, take appropriate action at an appropriate time. This is some work that was undertaken by Jim Hall as part of his lead role in the Global Commission on Adaptation's study of infrastructure systems. And this is a really nice case study in the Thames Estuary, looking at the potential application of adaptive management, but using that, in this case, to identify some technical thresholds to adaptation. So I think some people have still got microphones on, so I'm getting a bit of echo here. And one thing they did identify that depending on where your major flood barrier is, whether it's in the existing Thames barrier location or whether you gradually move it out towards the edge of the estuary, that this also alters when you might need to pump the River Thames to drain it during higher tides or extreme water level events. And then also another threshold, another technical threshold, is when you actually have to permanently shut the entire river and permanently pump out all of the water. And so this is an example of, I think, of people trying to look at this adaptive approach, whilst also identifying where there are some real limits, hard limits to adaptation and what can be achieved with different strategies. In this case, to keep the analysis to sort of manageable levels, they focused really on just a particular strategy of where that location of sort of the major barrier would be. But you can start to look at all additional elements of this as part of a broader adaptive management strategy. I mean, the good news is that these thresholds are several meters of sea level rise away. And so for the moment, there's no concern about reaching these, and certainly in the projections coming out of the IPCC, these are a lot further beyond the end of this century. But of course, it's not just about technical limits to sort of adaptation. There's often social and financial limits as well. And I think there are some big challenges moving forward about this adapt or move kind of, I suppose, question. And the first point is that, you know, we need to premise, I think, everything on evidence-based and long-term integrated responses. There is no sort of one-size-fits-all solution here. And we need to be far more upfront and open about the choices and pressures on our coastline. There isn't at the moment, and it doesn't seem likely to appear anytime soon, the money to protect everything. And so we will have to make these difficult decisions about where those priorities are. But we need to give people longer timeframes to adapt and think about how to plan and that transition in a sort of a just way. And these adaptive management approaches are promising, but at the moment we focus very much, I think, on the technical elements, and we do need to bear in mind the social and economic components of that as well. That thinking about where that coastline is one thing, but just protecting some houses is not necessarily that useful if we take the heart out of a community. So we really need to think about preserving that community resilience rather than just thinking about where we draw the sort of the coastline in the end. That as we're building up and trying to finance these sort of transitions in the longer term, we can't just pay for hard structures. We also need to think about how we fund areas we're not protecting. How do we actually finance a retreat away from the coast? How do we help people move? Some of the initial models have only had some partial success. Buying houses is a very expensive business. Dismantling them later and so on is also costly. How do we actually do this in a manageable way and cost-effective way? And I think the final point is around, well, if we don't move, we have to bear in mind we will be left with residual risk. This image in the bottom right corner there, trying to show what Manhattan might look like after several centuries of sea level rise. You can just about work out the Liberty Island in the background as well of that image. And so if we don't move, then we will have to cope with that residual risk, because anything behind and lower than the sea is always going to be at risk moving forward. So there's just some initial introduction and provocations from me, and I think it's time to hand over to the next speaker.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Richard, and lots of food for thought in there, and people can start generating questions from that. So thank you. So I think next we're handing over to Louisa.
Great. Well, thank you, Richard, for your presentation. I think it's a very different perspective from what I can provide. So I hope that this is still useful for everyone. Just to give you a bit of background of who I am, I work with C40. I work on the Inclusive Climate Action Program. And I joined in 2019. And then prior to that, I was working with CARE International, mainly researching the impact of natural disasters on communities, particularly vulnerable communities or communities that have pre-existing vulnerabilities prior to the natural disaster, mainly in the context of Philippines and Nepal. So, and then also I have also worked in the Philippines and Colombia with community-based organizations that are mainly working to represent the voices of informal settlement communities. And most recently with C40, I've been working with the Mayor's Migration Council, which very much like C40 is an organization that is led by mayors and for mayors. And the Mayor's Migration Council is sort of dedicated to ensuring that global conversations on migrant and refugee issues are informed by the perspectives of cities. So I think I provide a little bit of a different perspective from Richard. But what we have done through this partnership between C40 and the Mayor's Migration Council throughout all of last year is that we have invited people like city staff working within cities, both in climate action departments as well as inclusion and social integration departments. And we've invited them to have group conversations and also one-to-one conversations so that they can learn from each other and sort of explore the topics that we are talking about today, about adaptation, movements, relocation, and also the impact of climate-induced migration as a whole. So we did manage to speak to about 15 cities from around the world, including, cities in Alaska to South Africa to New Zealand. And we were able to sort of understand and form a narrative around what we like to call the climate migration nexus, what that means to the partnership and what that means to the cities that we're working with. What we were able to understand and sort of the way that we began to frame the conversation around what the climate migration nexus means to us, in order to do that, we sort of break it down into different forces. We often talk about the climate and migration forces that sort of interrelate and have an impact on cities. And so we broke this down to the drivers, meaning whether it's, you know, slow onset or rapid onset disasters. Slow onset, a little bit like sea level rise, for example. We talk about scales, meaning not only the number, but also the rate in which this movement takes place, whether it has to happen in mass movements or slow, iterative, growing numbers of people arriving in a city, for example. And we talk about flows. So we talk about, you know, people moving around within cities, across cities, moving across borders as well, because that kind of adds a layer of complexity to the issue and the challenge of migration. And then also the direction, and then also the capacities of not only the individual people who are moving, but also the cities, the government structures and the skills and understanding within governance that is there to kind of respond to these movements. And then, so these are sort of the different elements that make up the climate migration nexus. And then the way we understand that these elements are relevant to how cities might act at the climate migration nexus is through climate migration movements. So understanding the flows that happen across and into cities, but also of the idea of moving entire populations, for example. And then as well as that, the local actions that cities can take to deliver climate action that is also leveraged as an opportunity to integrate migrants of all forms into the city, but also to use integration and inclusion actions to leverage awareness raising and other forms of climate objectives and achieve them. So I'll stop there. I was told it to be 5 minutes, so I hope that's been quick enough. But yeah, I'm really happy to be here in this conversation. I hope that the perspective that I provide is going to be useful to have some very interesting and enriching discussions. Thank you.
No, thank you, Louisa, and thank you for introducing yourself. My notes dropped out as you came on, so thank you for doing my job for me. But yeah, Louisa and I had a few great conversations before this event, and Louisa has many great examples at her fingertips of how cities are thinking and acting on this, on the challenges and opportunities that climate migration brings. So really looking forward to exploring that further in the conversation with Louisa. So next we turn to Barney. So just whilst you're unmuting yourself, Barney, and showing your screen if necessary. Barney has been working on climate change issues for a number of years and has been with the UN Environment Programme for the last 6 years, I believe, where he's a senior programme officer. His current focus is on the use of nature-based solutions to strengthen climate change adaptation. And Barney actually just recently ended an 18-month secondment to the Global Centre on Adaptation, where he was co-director of the Global Commission on Adaptation. So Barney, over to you.
Thanks very much, Fergus, and thank you to the Happold Foundation for inviting me. And I think, from my perspective, congratulations on hosting this event, which is covering, I think, not only an important issue, but also to date an under-discussed issue. In my 5 minutes, which I hope I'll stick to, I really just want to make 2 points, and they relate to those issues, to the importance of the issue, And just a sort of few reflections on, the fact that it is under discussed in many different places where it should be being discussed, and why that might be, and then I'll draw some a rather modest conclusion from that. So, I mean, as others have already indicated, this is an important issue, and increasingly it's becoming an urgent issue. Coastal cities are already affected by the impacts of climate change, especially flooding, but also saltwater intrusion and erosion and so on. Costs are already estimated of, in the tens of billions of dollars a year, and people are already being displaced by these impacts. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center in India estimates that between 2008 and 2018, on average, about 3.6 million people were displaced from coastal areas, largely as a result of the flooding from the monsoons. And potentially the numbers are going to, as it's already been indicated, these numbers are going to increase. There are 230 million people, it's been estimated, live at less than 1 meter above the high tide level. Coupled to this, urbanization, and I don't know how this breaks down, but I assume it probably applies to coastal cities as well, is actually on a fairly significant upward trend. We currently have about 55% of the world's population living in cities. By 2050, it's projected to be up to 68% of the world's population living in cities. And the bulk of that increase is going to happen in Africa and in Asia, so including some of the most climate vulnerable countries. Coupled with this, as been pointed out, not only do we have the climate change which is already locked in, but we are singularly failing to reduce our emissions to date. If we put aside the reduced emissions from 2020 as a result of the pandemic, 2019, which is whatever, nearly 30 years after the Climate Change Convention was signed, 2019, we had the highest level of greenhouse gas emissions ever. And even looking, what are the prospects going forward? If we take the most optimistic interpretation of commitments made by countries to reduce emissions, we're still looking at probably, we're on a trajectory to a 3-degree rise by the end of the century. So, and that's assuming that those commitments, all those commitments are delivered and delivered on time. So we've got a lot, the outlook is not very good. And it's particularly not good for people living in coastal cities. What can we do about it? Well, Richard spoke a lot about this, rather crudely. One can divide it up into sort of engineered or infrastructural solutions, nature-based solutions, or ecosystem-based adaptation, which, and those two things may be combined, and they may also be combined with various forms of social measure, including movement of people. So I come to my second point, which is really about why it's been, or the fact that this issue of possibly moving as a response to climate change has not been widely discussed. I mean, certainly not in the world I occupy, or the sort of part of the climate change world I occupy, which is very concerned, sort of the international policy level, climate change convention meetings and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, I've worked on adaptation, as Fergus indicated, for around about 10 years. we discuss many issues. We discuss finance of adaptation. We discuss the role of the private sector. We discuss adaptation in agriculture, etc., etc. But we don't discuss issues around movement, relocating people, or very little. And why is that? I think it's an issue which a lot of people are rather nervous about, particularly in this, politicians, political leaders, and also from the international agencies working in this space. I think that's at least partly a consequence of what was happening with big development projects 20, 30, 40 years ago, whether they were mines, dams, transport systems, whatever, in developing countries were funded by international aid money and which involved involuntary resettlement of people. And a lot of that went very badly, and some very negative consequences for the people who were forcibly resettled. And then there's years of kind of reflection and trying to build safeguards into donor policies, into the policies of multilateral development banks, etc., etc. But I think it is still a sensitive issue, and an issue which people are reluctant to engage with if they can avoid it. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, Richard noted also, I think probably more in relation to the UK situation, about how we need to be more upfront and open about the options. It was interesting that Louisa mentioned the Mayor's Migration Council, which I think reflects the fact that those who are directly responsible in cities and in coastal cities, those who are actually dealing with these problems, are now becoming much more ready to discuss these issues. But more broadly, I don't think it is, that hasn't happened yet. And so this is why this kind of discussion, I think, is so important and valuable. So my short, quick conclusion at this stage is just simply that if we are going to consider, as I think we inevitably will have to do, movement, relocation of people as part of our adaptation options, whether that movement is a result of public policy or whether it's spontaneous and voluntary, if you like, as is happening now with those people displaced in India by floods, we need to pay very close attention to issues of human rights, of equity, fairness and welfare, and so on. And that applies particularly in low-income and middle-income countries, but also in high-income countries where there are also, very poor and vulnerable people. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Bonnie. And lots of great points there again, and we're starting to get questions come through on the chat, which is great. So please keep those coming. And Barney, for those who don't know, is part of a report that was launched by the Global Commission on Adaptation that called for 3 revolutions in understanding, in planning, and in finance. And hopefully we can explore some of those issues as well. So our final panelist, but by no means the least, is Victoria. So just as Victoria unmutes herself and gets slides going, Victoria is a partner at White Architecture and by background is a social anthropologist. She specialises in environmental psychology and the social dimension of the regeneration of places. She served as an advisor to the Norwegian Ministry on Climate and Environment and also had an advisory role in Sweden's Ministry of Enterprise and Innovation. Victoria has a range of experiences that I'm sure we will hear about tonight, but particularly in her role at White Architecture, she has worked on the relocation of the city of Kiruna in northern Sweden, which I'm very excited to hear more about, and this moving image. Over to you, Victoria.
Hi, yeah, hello, and thank you for inviting me to speak here today. In the option of 5 to 10 minutes, I opted 10. I'm going to keep it, but bear with me. Also, English is not my language, so I'm actually going to read some notes just to make sure I'm on track with everything. I would like to take this opportunity to talk about the town of Kiruna. It's a town that's going through great transformations. My colleagues and I have had the pleasure of working there for the last couple of years. In this case, it's not the climate impact, but a human impact on the planet that is forcing Sweden to relocate the town of Kiruna. But one could discuss human impact, climate impact, is a marriage today. My hope is, however, that this story still can add to the following discussion. The challenge was not only moving the buildings or recreate new ones. Our effort was also about making sure that the community felt spoken to when we created the new master plan for the new Kiruna. A little bit about us then. We're a Swedish-based architectural firm with 10 offices here. We also have an office in Oslo and one in London. And we have an international cluster that works in Germany, Canada, and in East Africa. We really we work with sustainable architecture and urban design in all forms. Most of us are architects. I mean, there's about 600 to 650 of us, but we are an interdisciplinary practice since we need diverse experience to tackle the challenges that we are facing today. For instance, as you heard, I'm an anthropologist and I work in a larger team focusing on social aspects and inclusive design. Now back to Kiruna. Kiruna is an industrial town in the very north of Sweden. Sometimes people don't understand how far up Kiruna is, but it's really above the Arctic Circle. It has a sub-Arctic climate where the sun really never sets in the height of the summer and never rises in the depths of the winter. There is lots of snow and the temperature can drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius. The city has about 23,000 residents, and it has its place on the global stage with the world's largest underground iron ore mine. The mine is the world's second largest supplier of iron ore pellets. The mining company is called Luossavaara Kiirunavaara, but we call it LK only, founded the city in the 1900s. The city was placed at what was then thought to be a safe distance away from the mine. Today, the main level is at 1 kilometer below ground. So the mine, as you can see, is actually eating up the city. So the mine must either stop digging, which would create mass unemployment, or the city must move and allow people's homes to fall into the defamation zone. To address this, the municipality announced an international architecture competition that we at White won together with a Norwegian office, Glade Helsten, and there were also other people involved. And the task was to create a new master plan for a new city. The competition raised a lot of questions relating to today's topic. Is it all possible or realistic to move a city? In this age of oil platforms, space stations, automation, communication technology, is it at all necessary to have a city by the mine? If the city is to be moved, where should we put it? Close to the existing city, or why not further away so that future mining will not risk a second relocation? And if we come this far, can Kiruna's identity survive? Should the new Kiruna be a replica of the old Kiruna? And what do the people of Kiruna say about this? And who are they? We quickly realized that a 30-year perspective that the competition stated is not enough. We need to have a 100 years perspective. And we had to get to know Kiruna by understanding the people of Kiruna as soon as possible. When we did our first consultants trip to Kiruna, it was clear that people and the mine had a strong symbiotic relationship. Some people even said, when I asked them, I mean, is this okay for you to move? They said, if the mine says jump, we will jump. That's how close we are. And there was a variation of reaction depending on which stage in life you were in. The young adults were not so aware of the situation. Well, they were aware, but they haven't philosophied of it. A common thread was that they thought it was exciting to get a new city, especially the young men. Many young people, but specifically almost all young women, go away to study or live elsewhere for a couple of years. Some of them never come back. There's no jobs. And they also got used to dense cities with cultural activities that Kiruna cannot provide for them. These women also voiced the sentimental question of, if I come back home, will I recognize myself? What am I coming back to? Homemakers had much to say about this move, having young children. They were sort of living in limbo, couldn't make decisions about life. They had questions of financial compensation and if and which physical objects are going to be moved. They firmly said, we're not going anywhere until everyday services are established. Show us the schools and the daycare center. The mature population were fed up with this move. They've heard about it for almost all their lives. Especially men were frustrated, and they said that nothing is happening. We need communication on what, when, and how, for us, but also for the rest of the world. The elderly women were more emotional. Some of them even teared up talking about old physical memories that have already been taken away from them. Well, and never gonna forget one lady, she talked about the bench where she got her first kiss and that it was gone. It was in the defamation zone now. After understanding Kiruna, we created 3 key strategies to help us develop the city. The first one is leave no one behind, and it addressed that the new city should be for all people and connect all current residents during the whole relocation process. Rather than implementing a new satellite city that could divide the city, the new master plan is an urban strip to keep the community together through the whole process. The first step in the step-by-step strategy was to replace the city center. That was the most dramatic one. That's a task that couldn't wait. Within 2 years, that is about now, the existing center will be dismantled. The success of Kiruna's move relies upon it becoming an attractive and exciting place so that people will decide to move along. So we had an ambitious state-of-the-art strategy. We also developed 3 process tools to address the soft infrastructure of the relocation. The future of Kiruna depends, of course, of the knowledge, effort, and commitment of its residents, and therefore needs a continuous and intensive dialogue. One example of this future dialogue is the proposed Kiruna Biennale. That's an opportunity to exhibit and host events, to share stories, and give life to the vision that shapes the city. The Kiruna Portal is an extra large public shop for house manufacturing and also a construction recycling yard that brings people and businesses together, and old and new Kiruna can come alive. It's both about reuse and an act of processing culture identity. Now I want to show you the master plan and how it developed from present time to the year of 2100 or 2100 or what we're going to say, I don't know yet. Here, the new Kiruna Center is taking shape in the east, while the old city in the west simultaneously being deformed by the mine. Continuing to 2025, the city will create better integration with the existing environment. By 2033, the city will also have developed in a north and south direction. And if we take a leap now to the year 2100, the city can expand north, south, and east, and the whole present city in the west will be erased. It would not be abandoned. There will actually be a nice park there connecting the city. The master plan aimed to meet Kiruna's needs. We needed to create a more dense city center with social and cultural activities. We need to create new diverse forms of businesses so that people will have jobs. We need to preserve positive values such as the closeness to the nature. Today, there's about 30 buildings that are being moved to the new location. And of course, the beautiful, beautiful church will be moved and have a good place in the close to the city center. But to the consultation, we understood that Empe's hot dog stand was as much liked by the people as the church. So of course, Empe's hot dog stand is coming as well. Small and big artifacts are being reused. Even though the old city hall had to be demolished and the new city hall is built, the new city hall could actually bring both the belfry and the door handles are also kept. And this is actually my hand, not surprisingly, when I was there last summer. So New Kiruna is fully developing right now. Here's a recent image of the new city center. And the learning process for everyone involved in the project has been enormous, mostly that a city can be moved. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. I think really good presentation, really interesting lessons to draw from that as well. So you got, yet again, lots of questions coming through, and please keep sending those through. So again, thank you to all the speakers, really diverse set of viewpoints there. And just before we go to opening it up to the floor and some of those questions in the chat, I might just take the liberty of asking one or two questions. And the first one I wanted to explore with you, Barney, you made a really good call for this, but my question is, how urgent is this conversation? And by that, I mean that we progress thinking around this challenge of retreat and what opportunities it might present and what it might mean for communities, practitioners, and so forth who will face these head on. Perhaps we could explore this in a sort of global to local way. And if Louisa, I could maybe come to you first. So I'm particularly interested here in how urgent does this global network of city mayors you're engaged with perceive the challenge to be? And if I can, what has been that sort of trigger for them to engage with this challenge?
Thanks for putting me on the spot. So I think the perception among many city officials is, and mayors as well, is that it's incredibly urgent. The window of opportunity to act and to adapt is very quickly closing, and cities are really at the front line of responding. But I think in addition to asking, how urgent is the conversation, I think also, even before we have a conversation, I think what's really urgent is to gather the evidence, the concrete evidence to inform that conversation. I think cities often reflect on the challenge of elevating the urgency of this topic, but they don't necessarily have the quality of data and the relevant data that can support their claims. So, I was speaking to one of the city officials from Anchorage in Alaska, and she said, I need to understand how to make this issue as relevant as the potholes on the road. That is how, they essentially, cities are looking for that information to elevate the urgency so that their kind of leaders, not only city leaders, but also national leaders and international leaders, really, reflecting on what Barney was saying earlier, that this conversation is not really being had. So that they can elevate that to these leaders, and these leaders will commit and act now rather than later. Because I think another kind of urgency to kind of demonstrate is that this is growing underneath the surface in a way, even though we all kind of know it's happening. Because of the lack of data, we can't show it so much in terms of how it impacts cities. So anyway, and then in terms of the trigger, I think it's been a slow, I don't know if it's a one moment trigger. It's been a slow growing challenge that a lot of cities are seeing, cities like Dhaka that are really seeing communities from other coastal cities moving to Dhaka, and them being very conscious of the fact that they're a city that is constantly flooded, basically. Sure. So it's a growing trigger.
Yeah, no, that's great. And Barney, you made quite a compelling call for a sense of urgency here. Do you sort of, what are your reflections on what Louise has just been saying? And I guess, having worked in this space for a while now, have you seen any change over time with which people are treating this issue? Is there a growing sense of urgency, and does this urgency differ across the geographies that you're working in?
I think it is an urgent issue, and the reason why, and I agree with everything that Louisa has just said, but I mean, the reason it's an urgent issue is that people and cities, coastal cities, are being affected right now, and have been for some time, by sort of the changes which we can expect more of through climate change. I mean, part of the problem here, or part of the underlying problem, at least in some of the poorest countries or the poorest cities within countries, is that they weren't actually very well adapted to the pre-climate change climate. You know, people were still dying or having their homes destroyed or being displaced before, you know, we started to think about or recognize the impacts of climate change, and climate change is exacerbating it. And I think we are seeing that now. I think the worst effects in terms of, you know, impacts on lives and livelihoods are still in poorer countries, more vulnerable regions of poorer countries. But yeah, we are beginning to see more action. I mean, you know, the Indonesia's plans for Jakarta, you know, one example, you know, big, you know, I mean, that's a huge problem. I mean, you got, not only are they basically at sea level and facing sea level rise, but they're also sinking. Parts of Jakarta are sinking as a result of, you know, extraction of from the water table of fresh water, and indeed, as I understand it, even just from the sheer weight of the city, parts of Jakarta are sinking. So there is action happening. I think, but yeah, I still maintain that in terms of the kind of sort of high level global discussion about the importance of adaptation, I think the issue of starting to think about, you know, what are the implications for, you know, moving people either voluntarily or as a, you know, as a sort of planned process through from public policy is still at its nascent or early stages.
Yeah, thank you, Barney. And from a UK perspective, Richard, where do you think that sits on the UK's agenda? And I'm quite interested to lean here on the 2018 Managing the Coast report that you know explicitly stated that some communities and infrastructure will be unviable. And there was the recent 2019 progress report to Parliament that shows the lack of focus on adaptation in recent years, perhaps.
Yeah, it's certainly not where it should be in terms of making those preparations and investing in adaptation. I suppose the report showed that there's quite a lot of places where I think there have been some unrealistic expectations set. Now, ultimately, policy is down to central government, and they have to decide where and how much they want to spend. But I mean, what the committee's report showed was that there's long stretches of coastline that would not currently make the cut for getting money from government to support the kind of current adaptation strategy that has been agreed and developed in the plan. And those plans are, you know, probably not, you know, perfectly developed everywhere, but they have usually involve a high degree of community engagement and collaboration across a number of important stakeholders in those areas. So I think the risk is that people feel that they've got a plan, it's been agreed, and then it all just gets the rug gets pulled away from underneath them. Because the money doesn't turn up, because these things are not statutory. So I think we have to be this is what I mean by being much more upfront and realistic. You know, building plans that are undeliverable is just a recipe for letting everybody down. But I also wanted to, I mean, I just wanted to sort of say I completely agree with everything Louisa said as well about, but I also wanted to sort of throw in one of the global issues, and that's around small island states and we talk about moving, and sometimes, you know, I think there's this imagination that we can just shuffle our city or our settlement, because usually cities and critical infrastructure, you can justify protecting it for financial reasons. But you know, poor Pacific islands do not have the resources, and even if they did have the resources, they often don't have the space. Their option is to literally move off the entire island, or to sink with it. So I think that these things play out in different ways at different scales, and so these discussions, they're local, they're national, but they're also kind of global as well.
Yeah, great, thank you, Richard. And just to end this question, Victoria, from a local perspective, how important in those areas that are particularly vulnerable do you think having these conversations early is? You know, should this dialogue be happening now, or can we wait? It's been a suggestion that
it's too urgent. It's not imagination. It's already happening. I mean, we have to. It's over. But I think that what I'm feeling is it's such a poor, like, it's always the vulnerable people who gets, you know, affected. I mean, here locally, we're a rich country. I mean, we spend so much money on technology, and I mean, we're and again, that sort of is a point to this. Of course, they're doing it because it's economically beneficial. The mine makes a lot of money, and the people make a lot of money working at the mine. So when the economical arguments exist, money tends to show up. So I think in the cases of these more vulnerable areas, we need to maybe be even better. I mean, we talked about we need to get more data and stuff, but maybe we need to be better in calculating on the profits from an economical point of view, and say, hey, you gain this money, or at least you won't lose this much money if you do this. And the other thing I'm thinking of is that when I was there, I'm sure you were too, some of you, in Quito with the UN Habitat 3 in 2016, there was a really interesting discussion that the mayors were having with the academy. And the mayor said, and I thought about this a lot, he said that the academy and the research institution, we need to solve problems now. And you ask us to wait for some research report that might take 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. We can't wait for that. Can we have good enough research from you in a shorter time so that we can at least do something? And I listen, that I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with it, but it kept with me. I've been thinking about it a lot, because I also think that we as a consultants firm, maybe we could act on that good enough. But of course, I don't know. Interesting.
All right, thank you, Victoria. Okay, so we've got a few questions coming through. So Andrew Paul has asked a couple of questions. Andrew, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and share the couple of questions you had.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Yeah, I've been to a few presentations on adaptation, and what I was quite amazed by was to find out about the work that had been done by a US intergovernmental body that said that they'd done some remodeling of the effects of melting ice in Antarctica and Greenland. And basically that was showing sea level rise of about, was it 1 meter by 2050 and 2.5 meters by 2100. And that was consistent with the higher level CO2 levels, which kind of Barney was sort of suggesting is the track that we're on for. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that. And there was another point that was made about helping the global population be aware of the consequences. And the question was, what tools are available so people can visualize that? Because unless people, it's not just about adaptation, it's about changing people's behavior on their carbon consumption now, which is contributing to the problem. And I think one of the speakers made the point that CO2 emissions keep going up and up. So all the actions that people have been doing in the last 20 years have failed miserably. Look forward to your thoughts on that.
Okay, so there's two parts to that question. I guess there's the piece around projected sea level rises and the impacts of those, and then there's the piece around awareness as well. Andrew, hopefully that's representative of your question. I think that echoes a few other comments in the chat in terms of awareness. So who would like to have a go at that first? Perhaps Richard, you might want to come from the modelling and IPCC side.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I can't give a definitive answer on the validity of these rapid ice melt scenarios because they are, you know, this is you need a sort of sea level scientist for that. But my understanding is that those kind of runaway ice melt scenarios or ice shelf collapse scenarios are looking to understand physically plausible upper bounds to sea level, not the kind of the scientists' best estimate of where sea level is going to be in 2100, which is unfortunately lower than 2.5 meters. So I think it's these things are useful because they help us understand, you know, the real potential sort of seriousness, but it's as the sort of century moves on, the likelihood of sort of getting that 2 meters in the next 80 years, I think, is relatively is pretty small from my understanding. In terms of the information, the Climate Central map that's in the chat, I think that's sort of making that sort of information is really important. I mean, is it? Andrew asked, can he believe it? I suppose it's a model. So looking at using different sea level scenarios and identifying low-lying land. But we do know. I mean, I've just plugged some sort of numbers into it now, and we, you know, it does show where the UK's current coastal floodplains are. That the Netherlands appears mostly underwater, and that we, you know, that some of those are pretty serious and large-scale floodplains at the moment, even before we worry about coastal change. So I think these tools are useful to help us identify where we are at risk at the moment and where we might be, where those risks are likely to increase moving forward.
That's great, thank you, Richard. And Louisa, from a city perspective, is there examples of how some cities are raising awareness?
Yeah, there are. I think in terms of awareness raising, what I think works well is demonstrating the benefits of this behavior change. So rather than focusing on the challenge and the threat, turning it around and focusing it a little bit more on the solution and building collective solutions together so that they are community owned and community driven. And I think one example that I can sort of pick up on off the top of my head a bit is the city of Houston in the US after Hurricane Harvey had devastating consequences for many families that were displaced by flooding. In 2020, Houston launched its resilience strategy, and one of the goals of this plan was to remove all habitable structures from floodways by 2030. And they delivered, one of the kind of ways to do this was they conducted a sort of living with water workshop with residents of high-risk neighborhoods. And I think they kind of took some learnings from the city of Rotterdam that has also done a lot of this, because the city of Rotterdam, as many of you probably know, is at sea level. So they've done a lot of sort of nature-based solutions and working with communities. But anyway, back to the city of Houston. So through this living with water workshop, residents from the neighborhood were sort of able to essentially do master classes on what it means to be flooded and what are the implications of that, probably building on what many of these residents already know from their own personal experiences. And as a result of that, they were able to develop a city-led program that is called Buy In and Buy Out. And so it helps sort of, it works with residents to buy out of where they live. And so that was an interesting program because it was something that was reached through this consultation. So I think this is what I mean when I talk about working with communities to develop solutions together to deliver that behavior change.
That's great. Thank you, Louisa. Morning, Victoria. I'd like you to respond to a couple of questions that have come from other people. So could I ask if Florine Ortega could, if you are happy to unmute yourself and ask your question, maybe followed by Radula. I think there's a good theme in what you two are exploring.
Yeah, for sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, got you.
Great. So I've asked this question because I used to work in adaptation in South America pretty much like 10 years ago. And I remember that at the time they were developing a landslide early warning system in the informal neighborhoods of different cities in Colombia, such as Medellin and Bogota. And they were using the communities to understand how to roll out the early warning system into the settlements. And it was like I guess it was quite reciprocal. So they were like teaching the communities, but at the same time, the development agency in charge of developing this system were also learning from them in terms of how the risks were. And they were benefiting from, community walks with designated leaders to understand where the landslide has happened. And I was wondering how this is how this can be transferred in the UK context around the specific risks that the UK face, such as flooding and I guess droughts, which I understand are the main ones.
Cool, thank you. And Radula, if you're there, are you happy to ask your question?
Oh, can you hear me? Hi.
We can. Hey.
Yeah. Thanks for the presentation, Victoria. I just wanted to understand, because I've seen as well this movement happening before. It was a bit more forced, and it was by the local government forcing. Okay, it was done. Relocation can be done in a very bad way, I guess, but it can also be done, and we have to be careful how is this done, and because it could have different impacts if it's not well thought in the way that you explained it was done in Kiruna. And I was just wondering, how are you ensuring that that community bond still is maintained when you move from what I understood and what looked like a more flat city with local neighborhoods into a more high-rise tower buildings? And maybe how the engagement process happened so people could buy into it and enable that movement of people, the relocation.
Cool, thank you, Radula. So two questions there really around sort of community-driven approaches to which Louisa started talking, but Victoria, perhaps you could share some of the insights from Kiruna.
Difficult questions. And also it's difficult as an architect firm, you're a consultant. Sometimes you feel like you're pregnant and then you have the baby, but someone else has to take care of it. It's sort of out of your hands. It's the municipal, we can only support the municipality as much as we can with keeping the dialogue continuous. There's, as I said, about 23,000 people in Kiruna. It's 18,000 that are in the center area, which is sort of a number that you can handle in forms of making different kinds of contacts and dialogues. But I will have to agree with you saying that if you don't follow up on it, you might lose the social capital of people and the confidence. So it really is thin, but the connection that they have to the mine is amazing. I mean, it's really, I think it's more about the mine than the city sometimes, even though they love the city, but it's some sort of agreement. The mine is their father, or maybe even the mother, and that bound, I mean, it's hard to apply on other places. So I think that in this specific case, that's the ingredients. And then on the other thing about high-rises houses, there's going to be a mix of houses, and it's not. I mean, it's city of Care, because it's been talk of a move for a long time, and because the city is actually old, it has not been so many investments in the old Kiruna. You'll actually, I was pretty surprised at how bad some of the houses were. So a lot of them, of course, lovely. But, and I ran into a guy, he was renovating his house. And I said, how can you be renovating your house? You're going to move. And he just said, well, LK is going to pay it for me. I'm increasing the value of my house because they are going to give the right value, both for the land and for the house. And for that, I can get something new that's really nice. So that's how it is. That's how it is. So LK is actually paying quite a lot of money to buy back the houses of the people, and even the bigger landlords to take the bigger houses, and that's what's going to finance the new houses. And some of them are going to be high-rise, but a lot of them are not going to be high-rise either. I mean, I have some. If I had the time, I would have amazing pictures to show you.
That's great. Thank you, Victoria. Hold on to some of those thoughts. I'm going to come back with a couple of challenging questions after this, hopefully. So, Bonnie, any reflections? I know with the Global Commission on Adaptation, you called for more community-based models. I don't know if they have any relevance to the questions asked by Radila and Florian.
A few slightly random reflections. Firstly, just so I can respond to a point made by Louisa. She suggested that Rotterdam was at sea level. Well, I lived there actually when I was working on the Global Commission on Adaptation for that year and a half. And what was always said about Rotterdam was that 90% of it was actually below sea level. And Rotterdam is a very, pleasant and civilized city where all the water is, there's a lot of water around, but it's in the right place. It's in the rivers and the canals and so on. So it is possible to live, to have a city functioning well, below sea level. But even the Netherlands, which has huge experience, hundreds of years of dealing with issues, coastal flooding and et cetera, is going to be, stressed by, what's coming their way. To shift to the yeah, I mean, first of all, on the colleague from Colombia, I mean, yeah, early warning systems are, one of the most cost-effective ways of investing in sort of adaptation-related activities in terms of saving lives and livelihoods, particularly when combined. I mean, they necessarily need to be combined with, people need to know what to do when they receive the early warning. They need to know, where they should go to and how they should get there and what will happen and so on. So, but, investment in early warning, early action systems is actually quite an effective way. And because it relies on, it really gets down to the sort of ground level, it does rely on community organization and for communities to be sort of integrally involved in the design and implementation of these systems. Otherwise it doesn't work, because, each household needs to know what they should do when they receive the warning. So, and I think that point about early warning, early action applies more broadly to the question, if we start to think about things like movement of people and whether, in fact, I don't know the Colombia situation at all, but sorry, I lost my train of thought. But if people are to move, and if that, yes, I was going back to because the question was, they're responding to landslides. Well, maybe they were, kind of people were living in places which would be better that they weren't living in. So what ultimately was needed, I don't know if this is true in this case, but wasn't to be having early warning systems for the landslides precipitated by flooding, but that they actually live somewhere else. Might be better in the long run. But that, if it is to work in an equitable, fair way, needs to be absolutely grounded in full community participation in.
That's great, Barney. And yeah, no, that's great, and thank you for bringing us back to this move point. So there's a few more questions which we'll come back to, but just to bring us back to the retreat idea and the move idea, I just wanted to pose 2 questions to the panelists, and you can answer whichever you want, but I guess my first question is, where is this tipping point of adapt or move? What informs that decision, and does that vary across geographies? And the second one is that the movement of a community isn't a small undertaking, and who pays for this, or who should pay for this? So who wants to have a go at that first? Victoria, maybe you want to speak to how, I know Karina was a slightly different situation, but I think it's quite an interesting example of some of the tensions and challenges actually with securing the sort of long-term finance.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, of course, whoever, I mean, that's someone is benefiting from this move. So but I guess, I mean, the municipalities and the cities, it just has to come off tax money, and it needs to be addressed somehow. But I also think that there's investors like builders and developers that probably could be a part of the financial. I think you can make. I think that one of the strategies that we need to do is to actually lift the financial. I mean, be very creative with who is going to pay for this, especially in vulnerable areas where the municipalities have no money. So, I mean, is it more of a worldly question? Is it a country, or even? It might be a big question. It's difficult.
No, I appreciate that. And Barney, you called for a revolution in finance with the Global Commission on Adaptation. What does that look like, and why is the revolution needed?
Yeah, what I should note is that, and I regret this fact, is that the report from the Global Commission on Adaptation, Adapt Now, I think it's got some good stuff in it. It's a good report, but we did, I'm afraid, rather avoid the question of whether we should be considering a movement of people as part of our sort of adaptation portfolio, for the kind of reasons I sort of suggested earlier. A revolution in finance. Yeah, well, we need something happening on finance, because there is not currently sufficient finance available to address adaptation needs in general. I don't know specifically in relation to dealing with specific threat of sea level rise in coastal cities, but I'm sure that's the case there too. Without just wishing to say that, well, developed countries should foot the bill, it is the case that most climate change, or almost all of climate change, has been caused by emissions coming out of developed countries, and those who are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change are the poorest people living in the poorest countries, who did the least to contribute to those to that climate emission. That's a basic fact which cannot be iterated enough. We need to keep recognizing that. But I mean, clearly, and as early as the Copenhagen Conference of the Parties, I think it's in 2009, but then certainly reconfirmed in the Paris Agreement of 2015, developed countries committed to providing $100 billion of finance per year from 2020 onwards to help developing countries adapt. They are not doing that yet. We're now in 2021. Even that is not happening. And even if you split that 50-50 adaptation and mitigation, adaptation costs, 50 billion a year, that is nothing to what the estimated adaptation costs are. We estimated adaptation costs in developing countries by 2030, maybe as much as $300 billion a year. At the moment, we're not, international public finance on adaptation is around 30 billion a year, a tenth of what anticipated needs are. So we're well behind. But I mean, the developing countries they should push as hard as they possibly can and make the political case as hard, as strong as. But in the end, they will. I'm not optimistic that they will have all their adaptation needs paid for by developed countries. A lot of countries are going to have to do it, if not wholly on their own. They're going to have to, given the world we live in, be very proactive in investing their own resources in adaptation, including on the issue of.
Okay, no, that's great. Thank you, Barney. And Louisa, what's happening in cities today? What are some of the examples of, how cities are thinking about trying to finance or decide whether to adapt or whether to move?
I think the question of finance is a really, really important one. And I think the challenge that cities are facing is not necessarily that financial mechanisms don't exist, is that it's actually that they can't necessarily tap into those financial mechanisms. And so I think that's where the focus of the conversation really lies. And I think to the point of whether to adapt or move, as much as possible, the aim is to adapt, especially because that often can lie within their remit. Like they can take action on a specific piece of land, like a settlement, or they can take action on introducing, building a levee, etc. But they might not necessarily have the remit to take action on whether to shift an entire population. So I think the question is for cities, from my perspective and from what I've heard from them, is more, how do we tap into the financial mechanisms that are available, and how do we elevate the issue so that national governments will ensure that city voices are involved in the conversations that define how these financial mechanisms are built.
No, really interesting point. Thank you, Louisa. And Richard, I've lost you from my screen, but I'm hoping you're still there and might be able to talk to this tipping point. Maybe Richard isn't there, in which case we'll try and find him, and we'll Melissa, you've been dropping some really great comments in the chat, and thank you for reaching out before the event. Just invite you to share your reflections and questions that you've been typing away.
Yeah, I think really the key point is, in my work internationally, one of the key things that has really stood out is that many of the visions for future cities, and especially with respect to climate change, are very much born of Western ideologies. They're born from not merely Western scientific cultures, but the whole processes of the West. And there are many assumptions that are inherent in these visions. So, for example, the idea that it's optimal to move to high-rise buildings, culturally, particularly in the global South, that presents all manner of issues, and especially in places like India, where the street culture is absolutely integral to people's religious, their social, their entire community structure. But it is incredibly prevalent. And I mean, I've been reviewing future cities in the context of natural hazards in depth for the past 15 or so years, and I have yet to see a flawless proposal on the part of any major international firm. What I tend to see are overly simplistic ideas that, you know, are born, as I said, of this Western ideology. They're born of oversimplification. And while that presents problems for the global North, it's especially problematic when you look to the South. And what I wonder is what methods are the various parties here actually using it in an attempt to try and mitigate this problem. So, for example, to what extent are the inherent architectural vernacular cultures and engineering approaches within the regions with which they work being investigated? To what extent are other perspectives on these problems being integrated, and not just at the physical level, but actually looking at how it is that you make a community adaptable. So, for example, if we think about South Asian cultures, we might think about the fact that historically, from the Bronze Age onwards, the issue of flooding was dealt with through temporary architectures, and there were various different systems that were integrated. How is that being looked at? How is that being analysed? And not just obviously with the benefit of the indigenous and the local and the vernacular knowledge, but also bringing in those Western perspectives. So, for example, we can apply our engineering and scientific expertise to interrogate how robust different versions of these architectures might be, because of course we have the modeling technology. So we can marry these together, but we're really not seeing enough of this. So, you know, I want to know, what are you doing to try and make sure that we don't entirely dominate this narrative? And especially when, if we get that wrong, the implications to communities will be profound, it will be lasting.
Yeah, great. No, thank you, Melissa. Lots of great points in there, which I'm sure all three speakers can respond to. Louisa, would you mind starting with some reflections on how cities are approaching the challenge now in response to what Melissa said?
Yeah, I think that was a really, really important point that Melissa just made, and fully agree with you. I think from my perspective and my background working in the Philippines and Colombia, indigenous perspectives are so critical. And I think the relationship that a lot of indigenous communities have with nature, we have so much to learn from that. And we are in C40, speaking for C40 specifically, we have been making significant efforts most recently to develop regionalized perspectives on what we mean when we talk about ambitious climate action, for example. So that's one thing we're doing. More concretely, we have a lot of work with different cities on developing and delivering their climate action plans. And I can highlight the city of Auckland in New Zealand, who has actually worked with the Maori communities and developed an integrated resilience strategy that is in both English and Maori. I think that's the name of the language. I apologize if I got that one wrong. But it is a very great example of how that integration is taking place. And I really am happy to share the resilience strategy with you, which the city of Auckland shared with me bilaterally, if you want.
Great, thank you, Louisa. And Victoria, what are some of the tools that you're using? I think, you know, as a social anthropologist, this is great.
Our whole work method is built for this. It's to be norm creative, search up people to find them, make sure that children, young women, and elderly people and the different religious groups or whatever are being represented in the material. So that's what we do, and that's my biggest struggle, regardless of doing it in Sweden or if we do it in our projects in Kenya. But what I'm known is that in Kenya, where I have most planning experience from, they're very happy when they see me and they said, "Oh, you're a social planner. Finally, Sweden is not sending another engineer." Finally, someone is trying to maybe understand us and how we work. But it is a struggle, because you really have to work with the local. I mean, basically, they have to take over and lead the planning because they understand. I mean, it's not only about understanding the culture way of living, it's the underlying politics of things. And I have that experience from Ethiopia as well, from Addis Ababa. But it's a struggle. I mean, that's not, I cannot myself point and say, this is great. We've been working in Kisumu for the past year with 4 different plans, and we had some huge consultations, and I really hope we can deliver on that. Otherwise, I'll have to hide and never go to Kisumu again.
Thank you, Victoria. And just before I think we start wrapping things up, Barney, can we gather your reflections on Melissa's points?
If you will allow me, I just wanted to respond to your earlier, just before you posed the question of, have we reached a tipping point? And I was just thinking, there isn't a single tipping point here. There isn't a single tipping point, partly because where a city has to start thinking about, well, we're going to be we have to move people rather than adapt, because the situation of each individual city is so different. But also, for another reason, there's not a tipping point, because it is possible. You can avoid having to move people if you are prepared to invest enough in infrastructure, nature-based solutions, etc., to allow people to still live there despite the risks. And we'll give you the example of the Netherlands again. So there is no tipping point. And the other point where I would just want to sort of query this, I don't think we should be thinking of movement of people under whatever as something alternative to adaptation. What we need to do is to bring this consideration of whether people need to relocate within the within the adaptation debate. It is a type of adaptation, and it's a type of adaptation that people are themselves already people are migrating out of areas because of climate, or certainly because climate change has exacerbated their existing difficulties. So, we need to think of this as an adaptation strategy. It's an adaptation strategy which some people are already adopting. But, we need to put it in that context rather than seeing it as something completely different from, other forms of adaptation.
Yeah, great, and that's a great call to action. So thank you for the responses there. And Melissa, do join the next conversation, which a lot of the issues you talk to will continue to be explored through as well. So I think we've just gone past 5:30 now. So what I might do is just ask each of the speakers to reflect on what we've heard this evening, and just summarize back to us some of the key points and key things you think we need to focus on going forward. And particularly interested to hear your thoughts on, this is a really complex challenge of engineering, of empathy, of social sciences, and breaking down these barriers of uncertainty as well. And I wonder, what are the skills that we will need as urban practitioners and communities to work through the opportunities and challenges that, as Barney says, considering the movement of people as an adaptation option? What skills will we need to do that? And just wants to give you a couple of seconds to think. We unfortunately lost Richard, who's had a power cut in his neighbourhood, so he won't be returning. But I'll go back reverse order. So. Barney?
I was just gathering my thoughts. What can I say in a very short space of time? I certainly don't. I don't think we should avoid the risk of knocking technology and steel and concrete. They have been very helpful in helping improve our lives, and including to adapt to the climate under which we live. And they will continue to be very helpful in going forward in designing better, more livable, more attractive, more resilient cities across the world. So we need to be able to, so clearly, but when we start talking about movement of peoples, then we're raising a whole bunch of also, you know, moral, ethical, political issues about fairness and justice and so on. So on that, I think we need to think about how we empower people to be participating in, you know, the people affected are participating in those decisions, and that's an issue which every society basically should, you know, address in its own right wherever possible. You know, there are no single solutions to that, and we have to think also about how to link kind of solutions and issues where, you know, engineering and infrastructure can help us, you know, in designing those better, more livable, more desirable cities, you know, wherever they are in the world. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Barney. And Victoria?
Well, as I said in the beginning of my presentation, I mean, the challenges that we are facing are very difficult. And I think the only way to really address them is to be a diverse group and work interdisciplinary. And I see when people talk that they work multidisciplinary, you have someone working with this here and someone working with this here. No, you have to work together and understand the challenges. So I really believe in that. And there's so much to learn when you sit in a room with a biologist, an economist, and a whatever, architect, a building planner, and you see them tackle, instead of going in the narrow mind, we all sort of open up for each other and you'll have better solutions. So that's one way.
Great, thank you. And Louisa, to close.
Well, first of all, I completely agree with Victoria. I think there's a lot of examples that we can learn from our cities that are working on task forces that are bringing these different perspectives together, and the solutions and the sort of approaches that they take are just so much stronger, and really kind of elevate the fact that everybody should benefit in every way. I think in terms of skills as well as that, I think there should be a shift in focus of from like success being as economic success only towards success being measured as healthy, livable, resilient communities. And I think, if anything, the pandemic has, sorry to mention it, but that's one thing that the pandemic has really taught us. And so I think you were asking about engineers, and I think engineers have an incredibly privileged position because they hold the tools to use science to demonstrate what different scenarios can take place. And as a non-engineer, I think that is an incredible, like, it's magic. It's really useful how you can show how a building can behave in response to different types of earthquakes, for example. So I think using that privileged position to build those models that will help elevate that urgency, and that will help make sure that, you know, the appropriate resources are trickled down to the right people to deliver on this urgent work. I think those are the sort of skills, well, not sure the skills per se, but like any skills that go towards doing that would be great.
Thank you. Great calls to action from all three speakers there. And you know, this is such a huge topic, and there's so many more questions we could explore in here. But I think today's been a great starting point for that conversation, and we very much welcome continuing it. So just some things I wrote down there as I was sort of reflecting on what has been said tonight is that there is an urgency to having this conversation, and we need to be more transparent about having this conversation within the spheres of adaptation and resilience. And to some extent, we need to empower people to do that, whether it's communities, whether it's mayors, whether it's even at the national level, then where coordination is needed there. And to do that, we need to have this evidence base of, you know, what makes up the social fabric of our cities, what is valuable if we are considering move as part of this wider suite of adaptation options, but also, you know, the environmental data about how the climate is going to change and how we might achieve these processes of movement in a just way. And everything, it's great to see so many people on this call and so many people chipping in to the discussion. So evidently we have this network of knowledge, and there's a real opportunity there for us to share that and keep sharing that to inform what these strategies might look like in the future. So thank you all, panelists especially, but everyone who's joined us tonight, and those who have chipped into the conversation, been really valuable. And I, for one, have really enjoyed it and could keep going, but I know there's only so much energy at the end of the day. So thank you again to everyone here and on behalf of the Happold Foundation. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you at the next City Conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.